Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Taming the Mathematical Literature with MathSciNet. My name is Rob DiPolo. I'm the Director of Partner Marketing here at EBSCO, and I'll be moderating our session today. First, I'd like to quickly start off by introducing our presenter, Edward Dunn. Edward is currently the Executive Editor of Mathematical Reviews. Previously, he was an editor for the American Mathematical Society book program for 17 years. And before working for the AMS, Edward had an academic career working at Rice University, Oxford University, and Oklahoma State University. And he received his PhD in mathematics from Harvard University in 1984. Before we begin, I'd just like to take a quick moment to go over a few housekeeping items as well. The presentation is scheduled for 1 hour today, and we'll set aside the last few minutes of that time for a question and answer period. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation by entering them in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll go through your questions and answer as many of them as time allows. Should we not have sufficient time at the end of the session to answer all questions, we will be sure to respond directly to you via email within a day or two. The session is being recorded today, and the recording will be made available to you in the next few business days once it's available to us. And please be advised that we have muted all audio lines to avoid feedback or interruption during the discussion, and we thank you in advance for keeping your line muted throughout the event. And finally, please use the chat box once again to communicate with the presenter and myself regarding any questions that you may have during the session today. And without further delay, I'd like to hand things over to Ed to get us started. Ed?
All right. Hello. Well, thank you, Rob. And in a second, I'll share my screen with you. But first of all, I want to thank EBSCO and Rob in particular for encouraging us to do this and for presenting the opportunity. As you'll probably know at the end of the hour, I'm enthusiastic about what we do here at Mathematical Reviews in making MathSciNet, and so I'm really happy to have the chance to talk to people about it. And in particular, I want to talk a little bit about this new-ish way of accessing MathSciNet through EBSCOhost and EBSCO Discovery Services. It's one of the things that we receive some requests for from librarians and others about, what is the EBSCO interface to MathSciNet like? What are some of the differences between that interface and the one that you see if you go through the AMS? So let me try and set up the screen sharing. I'm missing that button now.
Yeah, the share button. You should have presenter rights.
Yeah.
Nothing else. Top of the screen, you should have there should be a share in the top toolbar.
Yeah, they're just pictograms rather than. I've got pictograms rather than words up here. Sorry about the little hiccup there.
We'll get this straightened out quickly. It should be one of the ones.
Sharing at the moment? No. So you say it's in the top toolbar?
Yeah, or in the.
There we go. I was on the wrong screen.
On the right, yeah. There are a few different ways to get into it.
Yeah, there were three
technology.
Tabs there.
There we go.
All right.
See your desktop at this point.
That's all right. I cleared off all the bad stuff. So you can just see some, yeah, the picture in the background, for those who are wondering, that's a picture of the Borromean rings, a mathematical object that entertains me. So now,
I just see your main slide. You look good.
You should see the main slide. Yep. Very good.
Great.
All right, great. So the first thing is to give you a little outline of what I want to talk about. First, I want to say a little bit about why there is a need for something like MathSciNet. Then I want to say one or two things that are special about MathSciNet, what makes it a particularly powerful tool to use. I'll say a little bit about EBSCO interface to MathSciNet and a little bit about the AMS interface to MathSciNet. If there's time, I will talk about a couple of extras that exist in MathSciNet other than just finding some bibliographic information and a review about published papers. I should also address something that comes up from time to time. I talk about mathematical reviews all the time, and people who access us, see us on the web, talk about MathSciNet. There used to be 3 products that mathematical reviews produced. In the early days, 1940 when we started, there was a paper journal called Mathematical Reviews. Then the world changed, and we realized that we were actually making a database, and so we made a version of the database available to libraries and math departments on CD. That was MathSciDisk. Then the world matured again, and there was an online version that became MathSciNet. So for a time, we had paper math reviews, we had MathSciDisk and MathSciNet. Well, 2 of those did not survive the evolution of the mathematics and scientific literature, and so now we just have one product, which is MathSciNet. So for me, mathematical reviews, math reviews, and MathSciNet are all synonyms. So if I sometimes talk about math reviews along the way, I usually mean MathSciNet. So why do we need something like this? Well, the mathematical literature is growing. We actually keep track of it, and over the last 76 years now, the data that we have show that the growth is exponential. And this is just a little piece of that. A mathematician would realize that that thing that looks like a straight line is actually a little piece of an exponential curve. And the formula for the curve is there. It's 78,000 times e to the 0.0357 times x. The key thing there is that the rate of growth is 3.57% per year over the last 75 years. That has varied very, very little. So there's no expectation, there's no reason for any expectation for the literature to stop growing at that rate. And in fact, what that means is that the number of mathematics articles published per year is going to double roughly every 19 years. And so in 2014, the last time that we finished our count of items added to the database, we added 118,000 items to the database. This is journal articles, these are monographs, conference proceeding articles, everything. 118,000 items. In just, by 2030, we'll be adding way over 200,000 items per year. So this is certainly one reason that you want to have a guide to the literature. It's coming at you, whether you're a librarian or a researcher or a student, at just this insane pace. It's like trying to sip from a fire hose. So this is one of the things that we try and do, is manage that insane flow rate. But the literature is also changing somewhat. One aspect that is changing is that there are pre-publication versions floating around. These sometimes are stable, sometimes are unstable. Just had a conversation with a mathematician who is telling me that the important version of the paper on the archive was not version 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, but version 6. That's an issue that a lot of mathematicians have to worry about. There are also many more venues for publishing. With online publishing, it's very easy to start a new journal, and some people are very good at it, and some people are beginners and have some startup issues that they forget to get an ISSN, they don't know anything about DOIs. And at MathSciNet, we see lots of new journals being presented to us. In a typical year, we have between 150 and 300 new journals proposed to us for coverage. Now, some of them are clearly, not suitable for us. People will just try to throw their net wide. We had a request for something that looked like game theory, but it was actually on making video games. It was the techniques of designing video games. We don't cover that. But there are many things that are part of mathematics and part of mathematical sciences and applications that we need to look at carefully. Is this part of the research literature? That's what we try to cover, the research literature in mathematics. So we have new journals from old publishers, Springer, Elsevier, the AMS, SciAm, Cambridge University Press. May well have new journals this month or next month. And then we have new journals from new publishers, and we'll try and make an assessment of whether or not that journal belongs in MathSciNet. With preprints, it's mostly the archive that mathematicians are using and math physicists and theoretical computer scientists. These are some areas that we try to cover, the more mathematical bits of physics, the more mathematical bits of computer science. And so I won't worry about preprints on people's web pages or other servers, but I am familiar with the archive, and we at Math Reviews are very familiar with it. And it's an important piece of what people are doing. But I say caveat lector. There's very little vetting or refereeing of the papers that go in there. They look to see if it looks like mathematics, but is it serious? Is it a joke? Is it someone just trying to collect a Millennium Prize? So this is not part of the refereed literature, but that means that it's not part of what we're asked by the AMS, the American Mathematical Society, to cover. But the volume of preprints is increasing. If you look at the archive's data, this is what the monthly downloads from the archive look like. So per month, the number of downloads by readers of the archive is growing also exponentially. So this is not so much a picture of the growth of the literature, but a growth of this piece of the literature, the preprint usage. And so I don't know if you can see these numbers, but they're on the order of 11 million to 12 million downloads per month now at the archive. In terms of total preprints on the archive, it was only recently that they crossed the mark of 1 million papers on the archive, but that's a lot. Here's a cross-section of what's in the archive by year. In the beginning, the archive was really dominated by high-energy physics. The people who started it were involved in high-energy physics, and then it started spreading kind of to scientific neighbors. It spread to condensed matter and astrophysics, it spread to mathematics, and the percentage of papers in the archive added per year has changed as the popularity, as the acceptance of preprints has grown. And it's almost as if it's some sort of epidemiology of a disease spreading, although I wouldn't characterize the archive as a disease. But you can see as the subject is closer to higher energy physics, the sooner that subject took up the archive as a place to publish preprints. You can see that actually if you go finer into the topics in mathematics that adopted the archive, but that's a topic for another day. So the number of articles has increased at about 3.57%. The number of journals has increased as well. The STM report, which comes out every so often, went and looked back over 300 years of scholarly journals in STM, and there's a surprisingly consistent growth rate of 3% in the number of peer-reviewed journals. So again, the message here is don't count on the literature slowing down its growth. As far as we know with the number of articles, it's been consistent for 75 years. As far as the STM report knows for journals, it's been consistent for 300 years. Now among those journals, there are some questionable journals. And Beal has this list of open access journals where he finds questionable behavior. And again, he's not judge and jury as to whether or not a journal is bad or good, but if he's done his homework, he's giving you a little heads up as to what's going on with the journal. His website is particularly helpful when he does give details as to why he's added a publisher or why he's added a journal to the list. Of course, sometimes he just adds someone and you're left to wonder why it's up there. Now, another thing that you have to worry about with the literature and why you might want a guide is that bad behavior by the authors has increased over the years. Now, some things have existed for a long time, plagiarism and self-plagiarism. The advent of the internet did not create the problem of plagiarism. Of course, it's just made it easier to plagiarize things. You can copy and paste somebody else's paper very easily, no need to retype it. But there's also sloppy science that shows up, and there are also people who will take sloppy science to an extreme degree and publish junk papers. For those of you who know it, SciGen and MathGen are two programs that were written by some people at MIT who knew programming as well as some things about language. And in a fraction of a second, it will write a scientific paper for you. It's completely junk, but if you send it to a sketchy journal, they're likely to publish it. So let me go into some of these a little bit specifically. With plagiarism and self-plagiarism, one of the things with mathematical reviews is the review part of that name. We send a lot of our items out to third parties, experts, for review. And sometimes the reviewers come back and they say, this paper is exactly the same as another paper. And so this is a way of helping to spot plagiarism. Mostly, the most frequent sort of plagiarism is self-plagiarism. Someone publishes a paper once and they publish it a second time. And so we're not the literature police, we're not the literature court. When we discover one of these things, what we do is we write to the editors of the two journals involved and say, this appears to be the same paper published twice. Please deal with it. And of course, let us know when you have dealt with it so that if there's a retraction or some other note added, then we can annotate our database accordingly. We also see duplicate publications. Now, in the past, you weren't supposed to do this, but there are some areas, in particular theoretical computer science, where this is considered perfectly okay. You go to a conference, you present your paper, and there is probably going to be a limitation on length of the paper, 6 pages, 10 pages. So you present a sketch of the paper, or a sketch of the proof, and then you publish the same result a second time in a journal. And sometimes that second publication is very close to the first publication. And so we need to be aware of, when someone is actually in an area where this second publication is considered standard practice. And so our specialized editors inside the building who cover areas of mathematics and computer science, try to be aware of this, and we try to keep up to date on these changes. For people generally, retraction watch is a way of keeping track of when papers have been retracted. You can look either by journal, or here I've looked at their top 25 or top 50 list and listing who's had the most retractions. That retraction watch is spotted. So yet another sign that the literature bears monitoring, and there are plenty of people out there monitoring it. Mathematical reviews is one, but Retraction Watch is another, and I mentioned Beal earlier. In sloppy science, this is a case of a paper that was published in Science magazine, and it made a big splash. There were articles about it in the New York Times and other non-scientific media. It had to do with whether or not saying something about same-sex marriage influenced the answers that people would give if you were trying to conduct a survey. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that the younger of the two researchers who claimed to have done the field work apparently didn't really do the field work, and so the paper itself had to be retracted. So here was a high-profile paper in a very high-profile journal, Science, that was caught up in this issue of sloppy science. Here, just for fun, is an example of what you get if you run MathGen. So I entered only a couple of parameters. I told it the names of the authors and let it have fun and just make up anything. So it made up the title of the paper, it made up the abstract for me, and then it created a 10 or 15-page paper for me with all sorts of buzzwords in it, talking about conjecture of Wiles, presumably Andrew Wiles, lots of citations in there. So on the face of it, if you're only going to look at this paper for 5 or 10 seconds, it looks like a math paper. But it took something like 0.6 or 0.7 seconds for me to write it. And if I was just hoping to pump up my publication list, I could send this off to an obscure journal in the South Pacific or the middle of the United States, perhaps, and squeeze it past editors who do too little refereeing. So what do you do when the literature is growing at this exponential rate, that the behavior of some publishers, behavior of some authors is suspect, and you just don't have personally the capacity to filter through it? So to try and tame it, various things have grown up over the years. The most recent, I list first, is Google and Google Scholar. This is a search facility that allows people just to go find things on topics that they're interested in. Google is very good at search. They have server farms that are warming up small towns in Idaho and other places. And it's a very general site in terms of what they're covering. It's not just mathematics, it's not just science, it's also engineering and literature, the humanities, everything can be searched with Google. Thomson Reuters has Web of Science. Elsevier has Scopus. A consortium of the European Mathematics Society, FITS, which is a quasi-government-affiliated organization in Germany, Fachsinformationszentrum. The Heidelberg Academy of Sciences and Arts, Heidelberg Akademie der Wissenschaft, and Springer Verlag make CB Math, and they cover mathematics. And then we have MathSciNet, which is a product of the American Mathematical Society, and we cover mathematics, and neighboring areas that are highly mathematical. I want to talk a little bit about the individual things here. So Google, Web of Science, and Scopus are fairly general, right? They cover as much science as they can, and Google, of course, goes even more widely. They provide indexing and searching of the literature. Their evaluations in terms of what they're going to serve up for you and are done mostly algorithmically. Things can be a little bit wobbly with Google because they're searching the entire internet. They will sometimes turn up things that are lecture notes or slides from presentations. And so sometimes the counts have multipliers in them. They don't always get it right to distinguish a preprint from a published paper, or a preprint that occurs once on an author's website, once someplace else. ZBMath and MathSciNet we're both very focused on mathematics. We provide indexing and searching. We also have algorithmic evaluation. We don't want searches that are equivalent to you just picking up the phone and asking me to find something for you. We want to use the power of having a database. But we also have evaluation by experts. And this happens in two ways. For MathSciNet, we have the experts who are on staff at Mathematical Reviews, and I'll say a little bit more about what sort of experts we have. But then we also have the experts that are the 19,000 plus reviewers to whom we send the items. So now I'd like to make a little case as to why it's useful to have experts involved. So there was a paper in PLOS Computational Biology almost a year ago today now, and they were trying to evaluate the advice that is typically given to young writers of science. Things like have a clear, concise abstract, try to avoid jargon as much as possible, use short sentences, don't complicate your writing. Try to make it as human readable as possible. And then what they did was they tried to compare what happens if you follow those rules with what happens when people are doing searches to find the literature, right? And so when we think of a Google search, we think somehow or another that this is an objective thing, that there's just an algorithm that's making some choices, and what they find first is probably the first thing I ought to be looking at. But you have to be careful because once you start poking around, you can influence the system a little bit. And so this chart that is on the screen now, you should look along the horizontal thing. These are characteristics of the abstract and how it has a positive or negative effect on the number of citations that a paper might have. So blue means that there's a positive effect and red means there's a negative effect. So if your abstract has very few words, it's going to have a negative effect on the number of citations that your paper is going to have over the next year or so. If you use lots of superlatives, R8 on that list, you're going to have more citations showing up. If you give signals by saying things explicitly, this is a new approach, that's going to have positive effects. Using short sentences has negative effect on everybody, except in mathematics and physics it has a positive effect, and in psychology it's neutral. So somehow or another, just the way you write your abstract can have an effect on the number of citations that come along. So the researchers behind this study looked into what this might be. So short abstracts, few sentences, consistently lead to fewer citations. More adjectives, more adverbs, more citations. And if you avoid common and easy words, you also get more citations. So in an interview with the author, one of the authors in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the question was, why is it that you're more likely to cite a dense article than a more understandable one? And we can all read, but the hypothesis that they propose is the way that people are finding these papers. You're no longer going to the library and flipping through journals and reading an abstract as a human and stopping at the ones that are of interest to you. Instead, people are relying on algorithmic searches. And so things that have more specificity, more features that make them unique, more things that the algorithm likes are going to rise to the top, whether or not the scientist finds this of value or not. And so now that this article is out there, certainly scientists should be thinking about the way they write their abstracts. You should be making them dense. You should fill them with jargon. The more you obfuscate, the more you're going to have citations. Unfortunately, this is not necessarily what you want for the humans, but this is what you want for the search engines. So let me get to a little bit about what's behind MathSciNet and why we can help people with situations like this. So I mentioned before that we rely on experts. So in Ann Arbor, we have a staff of 80 people. So inside our building, we have 17 people with PhDs in mathematics. We have 5 who have postgraduate degrees in library science, mostly dealing with cataloging. We have people with advanced degrees in software and database related subjects. And we have 18 copy editors who help make sure that whatever our reviewers send back to us, they get copy edited so that they're readable by the general public. And then as a separate item here, I mentioned we have, as of Monday, we have 19,195 active reviewers. So these are people who have PhDs in mathematics or computer science, theoretical physics, and have offered their services to review the items that we receive and send off to them. And they also let us know the areas of their expertise so that if we have a paper in geometry, we don't accidentally send it to someone who's a specialist in differential equations. So we try and pair papers with reviewers so that it's not just a mathematician, but that it's a mathematician in this specific area. Here's a picture of some of us. I'm in there somewhere with my arms folded, as a matter of fact. That was a spring day, and in Ann Arbor, spring days might be sunny, but they're not always warm. So this is a picture of the people who are willing to stand outside on a sunny but chilly day. So how do we put this expertise to work? Well, we use this pool of 19,000 experts to generate reviews. We use this pool of experts in library science, and there are more catalogers than just the ones who have the postgraduate degrees in it, to make sure that our bibliographic information is as accurate as possible, and that involves author authority. We try to make sure that if we have 2 people named Edward Dunn, that there are really 2 people named Edward Dunn. And if there's one Edward Dunn and one Edward G. Dunn, that's me, that we link them together so that if I wrote a paper one time as Edward Dunn and I wrote a paper another time as Edward G. Dunn, we try to identify that that's the same author and put these things together. We also try to keep track of how much the rest of the literature is looking at journals. So we have this thing that we call the MCQ, which is the Mathematical Citation Quotient. And later on in the slides, I'll talk about just what that is and how we compute it. But I always want to have caveats there. You know, this is just a number. This is not necessarily a way of linearly ranking journals. Ah, this is the best journal. Oh, this one's bad because it has a ratio or a quotient of such a number. We also keep track of the citations specifically for a list of 575 journals. We actually key in the reference list for the papers that are in that journal. And that reference list is then presented with the item in MathSciNet. And then we keep track of those citations, you know, what papers are being cited. Then we have the second sort of citation, which is that when one of our 19,000 reviewers is looking at a paper and says, this is an important paper, it builds on this other paper and cites that other paper, we count that in a separate list. And so you have these extra citations within MathSciNet that are where a third party says there's a link between these 2 papers. And so that's a little specialized information that researchers and librarians can find out about how the literature is connected to one another. it's not just that the author is throwing in every paper that he can think of. It's that the reviewer, who has a limited amount of space, says these two items are related in one way or another. Then what's nice about the electronic literature is that when a paper has a mistake or needs to have something added to it, with the web, you can link the errata, the addenda, the retractions, and the original papers. And as much as we're able, we try to reflect that in MathSciNet. So that if someone is looking at our item for a journal article, and that article has an erratum later, down at the bottom of that review, there'll be a little thing saying, there's more information, click here. And you click there, and if it's an erratum, well, there will be, the information about the erratum. And then finally, we have some links to the mathematics genealogy project, which is a way of extending the coverage, not just to the published literature in books, journals, proceedings, but also to the PhD theses. And, so here's one way that reviews add value. This is a paper that was published in Mathematische Annalen in 1951. And the paper is in French, but what it's talking about is resolution of singularities, a huge problem in algebraic geometry. It was conjectured for a long time that it was possible to take all the singularities and make them go away. And this author, Dervedouet, claimed that he could do it. And so here's our review, and our reviewer begins by saying he presents in this paper an investigation claims to give a complete proof of this famous conjecture. Page 2, the review continues, and you can now see that it's taking a turn for the very critical. A few general remarks: the language is geometric, and that's not good enough to prove deep theorems in algebraic geometry. The person who's writing this is Oskar Zariski, who became famous in mathematics for adding much more algebra to algebraic geometry and showing that if you want to prove the hardest theorems in algebraic geometry, you have to use a lot of algebra. And so he takes Dervedouet to task for ignoring this need for algebra, and then over the course of a couple of pages, very surgically takes apart the proof that was published in this famous journal, Mathematische Annalen, and shows how it's wrong, both in general principle, but step by step. This theorem can't be true because here's a counterexample. This theorem isn't true because he's made the wrong assumptions. This is an extreme example of a useful review, but it's the sort of thing that occurs from time to time in the reviews, that maybe the theorem is correct, but somewhere along the way you have to remind the reader that there's an extra assumption that you have to make. So I don't want to dwell too much on pointing out the mistakes in the literature that we have, but also some of our reviews will say, this is the greatest paper I read in the last 10 years. So the specifics of using MathSciNet, there are now two ways to access MathSciNet, through the AMS version of MathSciNet and through EBSCOhost. So if you go to the first screen of MathSciNet from the AMS, it looks like this. There's a bunch of stuff up there. Mine looks a little different because there's some stuff up in the top right. It says American Mathematical Society. That's just displaying how I obtain access. I'm on an IP address that's owned by the American Mathematical Society, so that's displayed there. If you go to EBSCOhost, and select MathSciNet as the database that you're going to be using, the first screen you see should be something very similar to this. Again, there's going to be some variation depending on how things are implemented at your institution. So what are some differences that exist in the EBSCO version? So the EBSCO version is facilitated by the EBSCO EBSCOhost software, which has autocomplete. I'll say a little bit specifically about that in an example later. They have a very powerful autocomplete feature for their interface. Their layout, once you get into the system, is going to continue to be different, but this has some advantages, especially to new users, because it's going to be very similar to everything else that they see through EBSCOhost. And it's also very similar, I find, to the screen layout that you see with many library catalogs. So for a new user coming in to try and use MathSciNet, there's going to be a lot more familiarity to what's on the screen and what you should do next if you're using the EBSCO version. They also offer, besides just the blank box of search, you can search by index, and I'll have an example later. And EBSCO, again, just as part of their general EBSCOhost environment, they offer a way to have email alerts based on a saved search. So some differences with the AMS version. We have author profiles. I'll show an example of that. If you memorize the picture I showed up before, the first screen that you come to for AMS MathSciNet is a fielded search. There's a field that's marked author, a field that's marked title. You can change what those fields are marked, but it's putting it in a way so that automatically there are Boolean operators and fields in there, so that you're not doing a search anywhere, you're doing a search just for authors. The citations that I mentioned, those are in the AMS MathSciNet, but not in the EBSCO MathSciNet. And the same with the reference lists. EBSCO is not taking a load of all the reference lists that we key up for the articles from the 575 journals. There are some things that are slightly different. If you want to save your result, EBSCO has folders. The AMS has a thing called the clipboard. All right, so let's take a little specific look at EBSCO. So if you go to that first screen in EBSCO and just start typing your search and don't do anything else, here I typed in the word differential, and EBSCO starts filling in some completions for me. Do I want differential diagnosis, association theory, enforcement, etc.? Now note that some of these completions are not from mathematics, and that's because EBSCO is using the information from their full set of databases. But as I keep going, it starts recognizing that I'm in this special area, that I'm in mathematics. So now it's just going to give me differential equations applications, differential equations for engineers. Then I mentioned also that with EBSCO, you can search using an index. So on almost every page that they serve up, and it may well be every page, but since I didn't look at every page, I don't want to misspeak here. Up at the top ribbon, there are some words, and if you click on indexes, it brings up some choices of indexes that you can specify the search to be. You click on the box there, and it's offering up author, institution code, institution name, ISBN, MSc primary, publication name, etc. So I want to do an example with author, since I think that one will be universally understood. So I choose author, and now I put in a name, Atiyah, a famous mathematician from the second half of the 20th century. And as I type this in, it starts, I get some return here. I have Atiyah, M, Atiyah, MF, Atiyah Michael F, Atiyah Michael Francis. It's reasonable to assume that all of these people are the same. So what I would do if I were searching this way is I would click all those Atiyahs. The next name that comes along is Atiyat, with first name Muhammad. That looks like it's a different Atiyah from the first 5. I would leave that box and all subsequent boxes unchecked. And then I would go up to the green box on the screen that says search and click that, or click on the button that says browse. What you can do if you want is you can click the button that says add, that's in the middle of the screen, And that will just add these particular searches to the search box at the top of the screen. And then you could call up another index, title or journal or year, and add those things to the search box. So that this is very similar to the fielded search that's in the AMS MathSciNet, but you have a different route to get to that. So if I wanted to search for ATIA in the AMS MathSciNet, you have two ways to go. The obvious way is just to click, on that first page and use the author field in the publication search. Since that's obvious, I don't want to go into that one. I want to work on the non-obvious one. We have 4 tabs at the top of that web page, and one says authors. So this, one hopes is obvious, is a search only for people who are, only for things that are authors. Click on that and it says enter the author name or the MR author ID. Not many people know their author ID, so that's a rare search to do. I put in the last name ATIA and hit search on that. And on this one, by the way, the example has Hilbert, D star. For the surname, for the family name, if you want to use a wildcard, you have to put one in. But we found so many people were putting in wildcards with the first name, the given name, that it doesn't matter if you put in D star or D. If you put in Hilbert, D, it's going to work the same as Hilbert, D star here. So with the T, when I execute that search, I come up with a unique answer here. It's just ATIA, Michael Francis. And there's some extra information here because now what I'm looking at is the author profile page for Michael ATIA. And this is coming out of the extra parts of the database that we have at the AMS. So we have the extra parts that are, his list of co-authors. You can see that on the screen. Down at the bottom of the page, I couldn't fit it all on one slide. The areas in which Michael ATIA is published. Areas in which he's published more frequently are in bigger letters, so manifolds and cell complexes. Global analysis, almost as big. In smaller letters, there's K-theory and category theory. So we get to use some of the extra information that we have in our database in the author profile page for Michael ATIA. But notice also that we only gave you one answer. We said there's Michael Francis ATIA and there are no others. In the EBSCO search, there were 5 of them, and we, as the user, had to click and say, I want to look at all of them. And again, this is because we have this extra data. We have this author database where we've confirmed that the instance of MF ATIA is the same person as Michael Francis ATIA. The instance of Michael ATIA is the same as the Michael Francis ATIA. So if you go back to that page, underneath that first set of, that first table of information, there's a little box there. There's a little plus sign. And if I click on that plus sign, it will expand into all the different names that we see for Michael ATIA. You would see the M ATIA, MF ATIA, Michael Francis, Michael, etc. See, I'm almost at the 45-minute mark here, so I don't want to linger too long on some of these. Here, the Mathematics Genealogy project, there's access to that directly from the author profile page. And this is what that looks like. It tells you about the PhD that Michael ATIA received. 1955, University of Cambridge. His advisor was Hodge, another famous mathematician. And it starts listing the students that Michael ATIA had. Again, some famous names in here: Simon Donaldson, Nigel Hitchin, Lisa Jeffrey, etc. Here, one thing, again, with the data that we have is the author identification can be complicated. In particular, in certain Asian countries, there's a much greater number of people per name than in Western countries. So a search for Yang, Y is going to turn up 586 matches. And the people we have in our cataloging department will do their best to try and separate Y Yang from Y Yang. You know, this is one of the things that is very difficult for us to do. So next, let's say a little bit about journals. In MathSciNet, we cover just over 1,800 journals. So here, this is not a picture of all the journals in our reading room. This is the British Library reading room before the remodeling. That's a lot of journals. And besides trying to evaluate some things about the papers, a lot of users want to know something about the journal. So with the data we have, what we're able to do is give one measure of a journal. So what we do is we count the number of citations to the journal and divide by the number of articles in the journal. And we do this over a 5-year period. And that's what we call the mathematical citation quotient, which it's easier to say MCQ. So let me show that in an example of the transactions of the AMS. So it's a long-standing journal the AMS has been publishing. And so here I'm looking at the MCQ based on 2014 citations. So what we do is we look at all of the articles published in those 575 special journals that were published in the year 2014. And we look to see whether they cited an article in the transactions of the AMS in the last 5 years. So something in a 2014 issue of Mathematische Annalen, for instance, we look to see if it cited any articles and transactions from 2013, 2012, 2011, 2010, or 2009. We keep track of all those numbers. You can see those in the blue column on the left. And then to normalize for the size of the journal, we add up the number of items published in the journal in those 5 years. We take those two sums and we divide, so and come up with the number 1.16. Well, this is a dimensionless number, so a user might want to know, what does that mean? Is that good? Is that bad? So we give something that provides a benchmark, which is, and this one I did for 2013, not 2014, sorry. This is a benchmark, and this says, suppose I considered everything as being one journal, right? All of the items that we've had published in journals over the 5 years before 2013. And just for the sake of a computation, say there's that one big journal. Then we compute the MCQ for this made-up journal, and we come up with 0.4. In some sense, that's the average score for a journal. So the transactions was a little bit over 1, so that's a good score. Here, let me give an example of how we treat errata. So here's a review that showed up, and I deleted the review text for space. There's an item here. There's the bibliographic information at the top. The review has been deleted, and then you see for further information to this item, see Journal of Approximation Theory, and then there's this red MR2961192. And if you click on that, that takes you to our listing for the erratum. And if things are set up properly at your institution, down below this will be a link that will take you to the original paper, and so you can read that erratum. One thing here I want to wrap up so there's a little time for questions is if you want to keep up to date on what's going on with MathSciNet, we have a blog which I write. I understand this is going to be saved so people can look at this later. The blog is called Beyond Reviews Inside MathSciNet. It's hosted by the AMS. That's the URL for it. Even though there's no www there, it will get you there. Here's the beginning of a recent post where I talk about how users of Math Overflow can take advantage of a new feature of Math Overflow and slip in links very quickly to either a question posed on Math Overflow or to an answer to a question. But there are all sorts of things that I talk about there. And again, I know that this is going to be recorded, so if people have further questions and can't get them in the Q&A period, feel free to contact me. The best way is the email address, so that's what I'm presenting here. And I'm always glad to find out what people like about MathSciNet, but I'm also interested in hearing what you don't like, because that's something we can actually try to correct and improve, and that's the way that we grow, is by addressing some of the weaknesses or things that we hadn't thought of. So thanks very much for listening, and at this point, try and give this back over to Rob for the Q&A. There's my screenshot again. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. I'll grab things back here so that you don't have to show everything on your desktop there.
There's nothing embarrassing.
No, I know. But no, thank you for that. We do have time for squeeze in probably one or two quick questions. A lot of good information today. Actually, a lot of questions have come in, so I apologize in advance that we're not going to be able to get to everybody's question live, but we will, as promised at the beginning, we will respond to everybody in the next couple of days directly. In fact, there were a few that were probably a bit more related to the EBSCO interface, which I'm trying to put Ed on the spot for those. I will do my due diligence on this side to get some educated answers for you folks on those specific questions. And we can also take some of these and put them in our follow-up email that goes out in a few days for the benefit of everybody to see the answers. But real quick, a couple of the quicker ones that have come in here. One of those, working backwards a bit here. Does MCQ include all articles in a journal or only articles reviewed by MathSciNet?
It's only the articles that make it to MathSciNet. It may just be indexed. We may not have set it up for review, but it needs to be in the database.
Okay, fair enough. Let's see here. Another one real quick. See if I can paraphrase this one here about the coverage of PhD dissertations and MSc theses being not as complete, I guess, and if there's any, are there any plans to expand coverage of those in mathematical reviews, MathSciNet?
Yeah, so with the dissertations, the ones that are directly in MathSciNet, those are the theses for which we receive data from ProQuest. So if the university has a relationship with ProQuest, then we will have that information in MathSciNet. If it's not in ProQuest, we don't have it. There are more theses available, or information about theses through the Math Genealogy project. Some of their information they receive from the AMS Membership and Professional Services division. But that's a very different sort of data from what ProQuest has. Also, we're working on adding theses from outside North America. We have an arrangement to add some older theses from France, for instance, that we're working on right now.
Okay. See if I can squeeze in two more really quick ones here. One, where to go? Actually, there are two or three that came in. They're very similar, actually. I'm going to see if I can paraphrase these together for everybody. Wondering about any plans to verify authors' names beyond the MathSciNet author ID to something a bit more generic like ORCID, especially to help with Asian and other varied names that are becoming more and more used. Are there any plans on those areas?
Well, we are always going to use the MRID as our ID for an author. We trust it because we verify it, and we work very hard to verify it. We are certainly thinking about adding the ability to have an ORCID ID on the author profile page. But at the moment, there's no plan to set up a dictionary between MRIDs and ORCID IDs. That would be a big matching problem. And as it stands right now, acceptance of ORCID IDs is fairly low among mathematicians, but as mandates are imposed, I expect that will change.
Good. That's good to hear. All right, last question. I do want to respect everybody's time. I know we're just at the end of the hour here, but this is a great one. I'd love to get this in here if we can. And again, we will respond to everybody as well directly afterwards. bit more of a high-level question that came in is, what do mathematicians and their students typically need from librarians, and what might be needed that librarians might miss?
Oh, well, that's a general question.
But very good. I like that.
Well, the typical thing, that I pick up is that they want to make sure that they have access to the literature. The conversations I have with mathematicians are skewed because I represent MathSciNet and Math Reviews. They like that if they're able to find something in MathSciNet, that it's very simple to go from MathSciNet to the library provided access to the journal. I'm in Ann Arbor, and so I can go to University of Michigan Library and see they have this thing called MGET. And so it's something where, because we're using, I think it's OpenURL with U of M, they can see the DOI for the item, and they can see that they have a subscription to that item. And so they can just click on this special symbol that's put into the U of M version of MathSciNet and go right to that paper in that journal without ever having to load up a proxy server or anything. So that's one of the things mathematicians love. So from their libraries, that the integration of access across different platforms. For me, because of my skewed perspective, the conversation begins with the integration of MathSciNet with the rest of the catalog. I'm sure there are many other things they want, though.
No, that's great. That's a fantastic question too. That's making me think it could lead to a good follow-up, maybe not a follow-up webinar, but a follow-up blog post or something else informative that we could really share out there with everybody and help out a lot of folks. But we'll take that up separately.
Right.
So again, we're just past time, so I do want to respect everybody's time today. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending our session today, and especially like to thank Edward Dunn for his time and his effort in presenting to us today. Thank you, Ed.
You're welcome.
And as mentioned before, everyone will receive an email from us in the next few days with a link to the recording of today's session, along with additional contact information should you have any further questions or comments for Ed or myself. And again, a lot of questions, a lot of good questions. Apologies that we couldn't answer them all during the live time here, but we'll probably summarize a few of those as well in the response email for the benefit of everybody so that everybody can take advantage of that. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you, Ed.
All right, and thank you, Rob, and thank you, EBSCO.